Oh, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Christy, and then we have plenty of time for discussion. So Christy Hammer is a sociologist with a 35-year university teaching career, and she's currently an associate professor of education at the University of Southern Maine. After telling her graduate students that there were only 2 biological sexes with variations, the students walked out of her class demanding that she recant and sought to get her fired, all in the name of restorative justice. One trans-identified student who felt personally attacked filed a Title sexual harassment discrimination complaint against her, which was summarily dismissed by the university council. Christy has a long history of working in LGBTQ youth advocacy and in promoting anti-racism in schools. What happened to Christy was described by others as an example of the, quote, woke attacking the woke, unquote. Okay, Christy, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Anne, for inviting me. I was, after doing enough research, I was happy to say yes to Anne, even though I had said no to, I don't know, between 8 and 10 requests for interviews from Campus Watch and Newsmax and Fox News and a bunch of right-wing people that thought that I was, agreeing with them that there's just 2 sexes and the binary is just strict. And so that was very interesting, but I turned down all the interviews except for this one. And there was about 40,000 posts around the US after this case broke, and about 4,000 emails, and another 4,000 signed the petition not to fire me that Jennifer Gingrich started, who's with us tonight on change.org. So it was just a little one-off, frankly small thing, and it fed right into the media and clickbait, and that's what it became. So I thought I would just say, what happened and some of the ramifications. So, and I guess I want to start that this is really a first world problem or a first world professor problem, right? So what, a student attacked me, I didn't even get fired like poor Ann did. And, was this the worst thing in the world? No. But as many years as I've taught, I'd never had even one student walk out of class. I've taught nothing but controversial issues and topics in sociology, and back to educate my second stint as an education professor. I taught mostly online for about 4 or 5 years. So I think just me, that not knowing how big a deal pronouns were, that's kind of how it started off badly. For just a small number of people. And yeah, and I have a long background of diversity and equity. So I think for some people, they researched me and said, wait, she's not a right winger. What's going on here? So I think that was kind of interesting. I also have a history of sociology of science, and I've studied about gender diversity. And for decades on the Week in Gender and Intro Soc, I would quote Anne Fasto-Sterling that maybe 2 to 3% of humans were, intersex. Of course, then I went down the rabbit hole after this all happened. It's only like 0.081 or something. But so I overtaught intersex by 100 times, maybe for a few decades. But I was hardly ignorant about the diversity of sex, and I was in science for the people. So what happened the first class is I brought up pronouns. There were 4 sections of this class. The other 3 instructors were freaking out because they didn't bring up pronouns. So they thought, oh my God, I did, and this is what happened. Mine blew up. I brought it up. One student, the student who had actually complained, had come up, and I'd written they, them, in my roster, because that's their chosen pronoun. So that was fine. And that was the first day. And several other people were very concerned about pronoun use in the schools, and were saying things like they were forcing middle schoolers to pick their pronouns. And like when a young boy said, I'll be she, her, ha, ha, ha. A pre-service student jumped on him and said, don't you take this seriously, and is that what you want, or are you really, he, his, and this idea that we would force middle schoolers to pick pronouns when maybe they weren't quite ready to. I remember in my own civil rights days, Virginia Irvine, that started Project 10 in LA, in the early 90s for LGBTQ youth, right, in LA. And somebody asked her, why do you call it Project 10, about 10% or gay and lesbian or something? And she said, and if it's supposed to be empowering, why don't you use the word gays and lesbians for youth in the title? And she said, well, I was 60 and a grandma before I could say I was a lesbian. I'm not sure if, young kids can. So anyway, I was a little concerned to hear that teachers were forcing middle schoolers to pick pronouns. And what really got me off on the wrong foot is I had said I don't use pronouns personally. Not that I won't use them for students, and I've had students ask me to use pronouns, and I always agreed to do so, but that I just don't personally choose them. I think I even probably disclosed personal information. I said my mom was the homecoming queen, my dad was the state star linebacker, and I've been gender identified and quite androgynous my whole life. So I just don't care to use pronouns myself. So that was misunderstood, I think. The second day, the second class, the student that filed the complaint against me, Title IX complaint, actually missed. So was not there when I actually brought pronouns up again. I had the words intersex on the board, Foucault, and the research about pronouns. We knew, little stories that if they just said he, that little girls didn't see themselves reflected in them. Yeah, it was kind of the old research about, gender neutral language. And I shared some of that because I could tell there was a little there was a little undercurrent of concern, maybe that I didn't do pronouns. And at the end of that second day, an old student, like my age, 60-ish, who wants to be a teacher, made the announcement right at the end of class. He said, aren't pronouns a fad, and hasn't science proven that there's just two sexes? And that was, the class ended, a couple of students went to talk to him. There was a buzz about it. I remember thinking, okay, we probably have to come back to this, but not immediately later in the class. Obviously, the student that missed that day had heard about those other students that other students made, and so came in loaded for bear. The third session just started, the first activity, and she interrupted. She said, I heard there was a talk at the end of last class. How many sexes are there? And so I was sophisticated enough with sex. I would have actually never started a conversation with two, because I know it's more complicated than that, though it's the binary works in general. And I was referring back to the comments. So I said, well, two sexes with variation. As soon as she heard me say two, she said, you're not fit to teach this class. She got up, stormed out. Then I immediately misgendered her because I was shocked. And I said, well, I hope she feels better later. It's they, them. And so about 3 of her advocates walked out with her, and there were several personally connected people with trans issues, all going to be secondary teachers in this class. I continued the class, and then a student leader, maybe 10, 15 minutes later, said, that was so shocking what happened. Christy, I don't think we're going to learn anything. I said, you're right. So the paper that said 21 walked out, it was never that. I dismissed the class after a handful walked out. You would never know that, how it went out in the papers. And the class then ran into a few students down in the hall. And anyway, so they all did ask me to do a restorative justice circle to try to bring the class back together. When I told my partner, tried to explain what restorative justice was, philosophy professor said, that sounds like Mao's interrogation, confession, execution. I said, no, it's restorative justice. There's all these best practices. It'll be good. It was horrible. It was done by a university administrator, was very, very biased, just unbelievably punitive and bad, was trying to dredge out the few students that were against me, more negative things about me. And it was just horrible. The 2 faculty that came, one said, well, at least you didn't go to the paper. And another faculty member said he'd never seen anything go right up to the top as quick as this complaint did. Students were saying things like solidarity were their points, or I've never been in a protest before. So this was just a ridiculous 3 hours. And then the university administrator criticized me at the end for not doing XYZ, which by the way, I had apologized in writing. And then she stayed after with the students to process with them, just so wrong and so bad. So by the next evening was the first article in the paper. So of course the student had gone to the paper, and the reporter, as someone said, knew exactly what he was doing, taking the story and turning it into a clickbait, and it fed right into the right-wing criticism of, you know, what education is. So that was distressing. Someone said it was a case of that we attack our allies when we can't find our enemies. And so since I'd had a history in LGBTQ advocacy, I think that was a part of the issue that many people, professors said, you know, you anti-trans or transphobic. But certainly once I've gone down in this rabbit hole, I had no idea that biology professors are being attacked for saying that there's just two sexes. I was shocked by how many biology professors around the world emailed me. I'm saying like 10 or 12, at least a handful, very similar situations that biology professors, if they don't talk about that little bit of variation in the binary as a spectrum or a continuum or a bunch of sexes in there, particularly if they're part-time biology professors. I heard two that were just fired, that parents of non-binary students would, you know, go on the warpath and would get them fired. So my response, 4,000 maybe emails, were right-wingers, three groups, right-wingers that were just glad I was doing the work and the hard work and speaking the truth, free rights advocates, free speech advocates, and then the third were these biology professors. And a fourth group that you folks saw, the sex-based rights that I didn't even know existed. I'd never heard of TERFs. I'd never heard of Substacks. I know so much more than I used to. But this idea that now even biologists are having to use wiggle worms like continuum and spectrum to talk about that little bit of difference. Just this year, one of the most famous, I think, undergraduate biology textbooks by Campbell, my daughter just happens to have it. And this latest edition, this was shared by a biologist that was angry, says, you know, this doesn't have anything to do with biology, but there's a new little, you know, side blurb in this Campbell's biology book on, I think it's named Biological Sex, Sex Orientation, and Gender Identity. So at least tried to touch that third rail to try to parse out those issues. I think that's appropriate and good given all the politics, that they at least try to sort that out a bit. The provost was in the paper saying he was going to help protect these students that were anti-Hammer. And I teach an online women gender studies class I have for years. And he even went to the head of the women gender studies and said, do you need another separate section for her online class if there are upset students? So they didn't follow the process. When students are upset, most universities have procedures that, you know, like when students were inflamed in civil rights and right and march out, that you go back and try to work it out with the prof at least once, you know, just, you know, go back no matter how, you know, mostly what they complain about. True physical safety concerns. And they didn't do that. They separated me from the students. They didn't make the students try to work it out with me. We had this restorative justice, which was really just a re-education situation. And the majority, here's the upshot. The majority of the students stayed with me. So even though the minority of students tried to get the students, they had an email group and they'd say, don't stay with that transphobic professor. They were putting pressure on the students that wanted to stay with me. So about 3/4 of the students, there's only 21. So 15 stayed with me, 16, and 5 left, and they had another section for this. And the student did file a civil rights Title IX complaint against me, and it was dismissed, and then they appealed it. So just last week did I finally, what a hellish semester, did I finally find out that even the appeal was dismissed. I think a part of this is just how tuition-driven universities are, and cancel culture and call out culture. And, you know, if they want to cause trouble and get rid of a prof, it's just a lot easier. I think too, to do it. I think it's part of the anti-science, right, that people don't understand. I had my first student ever say in the Women and Gender Studies, the intro class, I was lied to by my high school biology teacher. So, I mean, I've always been beyond the binary, sexual stereotypes, gender, right? But there's still the sex binary, and now students are being taught. That was just stunning to read. I read it twice. I was lied to by my high school biology teacher, right? Who said that the binary existed, and I know it's a myth. So I don't know, that's where we're at. I don't know, Anne, if I've already said too much, or I had a little bit about Title. Yeah. May I say just a couple things about Title IX?
Yes.
Thank you. So a bit ironic. So for 10 years, as I got my PhD and waiting for an academic position, I was the Title IX coordinator of the New Hampshire Department of Education from 1990 to 2000, paid for with civil rights funds, Title IV, right, that the Title IX is an amendment to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So Title IV funded, but I was in charge of Title IX. One fun fact, do any of you remember Pam Smart, who killed her husband? She was an ed tech. She was an educational technician in Winnicott, New Hampshire in 1990, and there was a big movie, you know, about it because she had her lover, her teenage lover, kill her husband. Anyway, in 1990, when I was the Title IX coordinator for the state, I looked at the list of the district level Title IX coordinators, and Pam Smart was the Title IX coordinator for Hampton, New Hampshire in 1990. So she had the ultimate final solution, just kill all the guys. No. So here's the irony. In the early 90s, I tested the funding of Title IX because I used the money that I could buy materials for teachers, and I bought an anti-homophobic phobia curriculum. It was called Sticks and Stones. It was kind of not a professionally done curriculum, it was sort of spiral bound. It was called Sticks and Stones Anti-Homophobia Curriculum for Schools. And I thought, because it was all about sex, it was all about girls and women. And I thought, well, should this money be used for LGBT populations? And so I did that, and nobody said anything. And then the teacher sold the curriculum. Teachers are such thieves. A couple of years later, and you can't find it now. I tried to Google it. So here we are, 30 years later. I got charged for a Title IX violation under this thing called gender identity by a student who I thought was trans, but just calls herself non-binary. Supposedly another class, she said, I'm a dyke. I don't know. I had no idea that gender equity had gotten to be this wiggly thing that's very hard to describe, much less that it's subsuming sex in the definitions of sex. I guess my own little 2 cents just studying this is the Title IX regs that were changed just last year, I think, to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Mine here, I had a trans student send me this shirt, Trans Rights or Human Rights, that I wore during the Restorative Justice Circle, and it didn't work because they didn't want an apology. So now I'm trying to reconcile the abolition of sex with trans rights. To me, the new regs for Title IX, instead of gender identity, why can't that be transgendered individuals? I believe that trans people maybe should be their own protected class. So get rid of this gender identity, which is not defined, and maybe that should be transgendered individuals that should have civil rights protection. Anyway, I think I probably said enough, except for Jerry Cohn on why evolution is true. He was a big supporter, and he told a scientist on that I learned how biology profs are getting attacked or fired even for doing this, talking about two sexes. And I was told that I would lose friends, that if I pursued this line of thinking and reasoning, sex-based rights, and, you know, a couple of trans advocates, they almost think maybe I was transphobic anyway. So it's been difficult. Thank you very much, Anne, for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Christy.